Hi guys, for today's video we're going to be focusing on how you can combine an image with transparency and overlay it onto your existing image. We're also going to be taking a look at a few new nodes that we haven't looked at yet, including the color ramp node, the ellipse mask and lens distortion, as well as beginning to reorganize our more complicated node setups, making things a little bit easier to use. Now, if you want to follow along with this 6-part series using your own projects, you are more than welcome to do so. However, if you are looking to use the project that we are using for this series, then you can download it via the link in the video description. But not only will you be getting all of the assets related to our project, if you sign up, you will also get access to our free Blender 2.8 PDF cheat sheet, full of keyboard shortcuts that are commonly used in Blender for things like navigating the 3D viewport, creating animations, manipulating nodes in the compositor, etc., as well as some of our top tips and tricks for making the most of your Blender experience and improving your workflow. On top of that, you will also have access to our bi-weekly newsletter for the latest information on all things related to Blender. So for this tutorial, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to demonstrate how we can add one image and overlay it on top of another. So I'm just going to zoom out slightly and just use the middle mouse button to bring my nodes up to here. Then we're going to go Shift and A, Input, and then select Image, and we're going to position the image here. Next, locate the image that you want to bring into your project. So I'm going to go Open, and then I'm going to locate my image. I then select the image that I want to bring into my project and click on Open Image. So now if we zoom in on this image node, we should get a display of our image, which is the same as what would happen up here with our .exr. So now what we need to do is we need to find a way of overlaying this image on top of this one. And there are a couple of ways of doing it, but I am going to use an alpha over node. So I'm going to grab the viewer node and position it here. Then I'm going to go Shift and A, and then we're going to have to find our alpha over node, which should be under color, alpha over, left click, and then position here. Next, I'm going to take the image here and plug it into the bottom input here. Let that load up, and you can see it's not quite perfect, so there's one or two issues with the image that has been brought in. But the easiest way to get rid of this for now is to just click on this button here. So if we just expand the alpha over node and just zoom in on it slightly, this convert premal option will allow us to ensure that the rest of the image remains transparent. So up next, what we want to do is we want to move this title Baliel design to the top corner. So how do we move an image? We've been able to overlay it on top of our existing image, but how do we now move this title from the center to the top corner? Well, there are a few distort nodes that we can use in order to achieve this. So we're going to go Shift A, and we're going to go down to where it says Distort, and we're going to start by selecting Transform. Actually, no, we're going to start by selecting scale because we want the right scale first before we move it. So let's select scale and drag it in to about here. And by default, nothing will happen because the X and Y scale are both set to 1. If we increase these values, so let's left click and drag to select both values. And then let's use a value of 3 just as an example and enter. If we let that composite, you can see that it has scaled up the image to 3 times its initial size on both axes, which is far too big. Now I do want it to be a little bit bigger than what it currently is, but not that big. So let's set the values here to 1.2 and then press enter. So that looks like a good enough size. Now we need to move it to the top corner of our image, and we can do that with a translate node. So Shift A, distort, translate, and we will plug it in between the scale and the alpha over. Now the X and Y values represent the pixels of the image. So these are going to have to be very high values. So for example, if I set X to 200 and press enter, then it's going to move our title image 200 pixels across the X-axis. Now that's going in the opposite direction that I want. So I'm going to use a value of, let's try minus 350. So a value of minus 350. That's looking good. I think we can go a little bit further along, so minus 375 and enter. And then let's try increasing the Y value. So we want it to go up, so we can use a positive value here. Let's try 400 and then press enter. And that's looking pretty good. In fact, we're just going to use the value of minus 400 for the X-axis. So here we've been able to A, add a new image to our composite, B, made sure that we are displaying the alpha channels of that image with the alpha over node, C, being able to scale this new image, and D, being able to move the image. Now we can actually combine these two into a single node, and I'm not talking about a node group, I'm talking about a single node, which is the transform node. So I might want to add a tiny bit of rotation to this as well. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to delete these two nodes, just plug the image back in, and then I'm going to go Shift A, distort, and select transform. Now you can see we've also got the rotate node as well, but we're not going to use that. We're going to use transform, and we're going to move the transform to here. Now if we zoom in on this node, you can see we can manipulate the X and Y values for the location, we can manipulate the angle, and we can manipulate the scale. However, in this case, the scale is limited to a single value. So this single value represents both the X and Y axes. So let's manipulate that first, 1.2 and enter. Just let that scale up, and then we'll manipulate the X value to minus 400 and the Y value to positive 400. So that gets it into the right position. Now let's add just a small angle to the title. So let's go 5 degrees and press enter. And that's looking pretty good. But looking at it, I do think I would prefer it if the rotation didn't change at all. If you want to use this to change the rotation of the title, then by all means, but I think I'm actually going to set this back to 0. And I actually think that is an adequate position for our image. So now if we zoom out, we can see that we've got quite a few nodes forming, and I just want to reorganize our node tree here, and I'm going to do that by creating some frames. So I'm going to start with our title image and our transform node, and what we're going to do is we're going to select these nodes, and if we go to add, which you can also do via the menu up here, go to layout and select frame, you can add in a frame, and then you can select a node, drag it inside the frame, and the frame itself will expand so that you can fit that node inside. So now it's just a case of grabbing this transform node and positioning it inside the frame, and then just grabbing and relocating it to about here. So you notice that the frame scales in size based on the positioning of the nodes. If we left click on the frame itself, we can move the frame and all the nodes that are inside of that frame. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to change the color of the frame, and we're going to make this a green color, and then just move the frame down here a bit. And then what I want to do is I want to just take the color nodes and position them in their own frame. So let's left click and drag, and to be honest we don't even need to do that because we can just go and add the frame, position it here, and then position each of these nodes inside that frame. Reorganize, and then select the frame and give it a color. Let's give this one a blue color so that it's easy to distinguish between the two frames. And one thing that I haven't done is I haven't labeled these frames. So with this color frame, we're going to go to where it says label, left click, and just type in color. And with this frame, this represents our title image, so I am going to label it as title. Then let's look at further reorganizing these nodes, and one thing that we can do is we can enable snapping to help us. So the snapping tool is located up here by this magnet icon. So left click to enable snapping, and then you can snap to different elements. So you can snap to the grid, you can snap to the x-axis, to the y-axis, or to both axes. So I'm going to start by using grid snapping. I'm going to grab my main image, and you can see that it looks glitchy, but it's actually because it's snapping to the grid behind it. So I'm going to position it about here. Then I'm going to change the method of snapping to Y. Grab our denoise group here and snap it to here so that it's in line with our main image. And if we try and snap the frame, so let's grab the color frame, you will see that we can sort of do this as well, but it is just a little bit, as you can see, just a little bit more glitchy. So it is better if you can to snap the individual nodes just like I am doing here. So now let's take this alpha over node, and I think we'll pop it in about here, and we'll take the viewer node, position here. And for now, I'm just going to change to the node X option and position this frame about here. And if we just move across we can line that up very nicely. Okay, so that looks much simpler than what it did just a few moments ago. I've noticed that the color balance is still muted. I'm just going to unmute that, and that will probably have a minor impact on our scene, but I actually quite like that. So at the moment it's just darkening the final image, which actually looks pretty good. So I am going to leave it at that. So what we're going to be doing next is we're going to be adding a bit of distortion to the image itself. So if this was an image shot by a camera, there'd be a little bit of distortion. There's always distortion with whatever camera that you use. So we're going to be using what is known as a lens distortion node. So we're going to be plugging the lens distortion in about this area here. So let's hit Shift A, distort, lens distortion. Now I only want it to affect the main image to start with, so we're going to plug it in here before the alpha over node. Left click, and then I'm just going to zoom in on this node just so you can see what it looks like. And nothing has changed because neither of these values have been altered. First of all, we have distortion. Let's just make that a little bit bigger. And if we increase the distortion, and we don't even have to increase it by much, but we start to get this sort of fisheye lens effect. Now, as you can see, just by changing the value from 0 to 0.1, that's quite an exaggerated effect. If you really increase it to, say, 0.9, then it creates a very strong distortion. Now, this might be the effect that you're looking for, but I'm looking for something that's going to be very, very subtle. I'm going to use a value of 0.02 and then press enter. Now I don't want the image to begin cropping in, I want it to maintain its original shape. I am going to enable this fit option, and that's going to make sure that regardless of what this distortion value is set to, we're still going to maintain the same straight outline for the image. As an example, if I increase my distortion value, the image itself becomes a lot more distorted, but it also begins to zoom in on the image in order to maintain the pixel ratio. I'm going to set that back to 0.02, and the option below it is dispersion. Now, when we talk about dispersion for lens distortion, what this is going to do is it's effectively going to create some discoloration around some of the edges of our objects. So if I make this a high value to start with, so let's go 0.3, let that composite, you can see that we're again beginning to zoom in a bit more, so it's creating more of a distortion for the image. But more importantly, you can see around the dodgeball here that the color is sort of blending from red to this sort of dark brown yellowish tint. If we were to come over to the viewer node and just zoom in on this area, you can see the effect that the distortion value is having on the edges of this object, but it's only doing that in certain parts. If we increase the dispersion even further, then we'll be able to see this effect even more. Set that to 1, for example, and you can see now that the effect is so strong that not only do we have this discoloration here, but it's almost blurred around the outsides of the image. Now, much like distortion, I like to keep dispersion to a very low value. So 0.02 again, I believe is more than suitable for what I want from this image. Now, lens distortion is a node that sole purpose is actually to allow Blender to act like a real world camera in terms of how the image is viewed. These distortion and dispersion options actually, they're creating imperfections in your image, the same imperfections that you see with just about any camera. Of course, a higher quality camera will have less distortion and less dispersion. Now, what if you wanted to crop your image to a specific part? Well, we can do so with the crop node. What I'm going to do here is I am going to add my crop node in, Shift A. I'm going to go to Distort and Crop. And I'm going to plug it in here. And it's not going to do anything apart from get rid of the entire image. With the exception of our title here, because this crop node is not connected to the title. In order for us to begin to view our image, we have to manipulate these values. If we start by manipulating this up value, let's set this to 1000, for example. Let's go 1000. And then let's set this right value to 500. And then we should be able to see a part of our image. So now it's a case of beginning to manipulate these values to see what we can come up with. If I move the right value and then the up value, the goal would be to try and get our entire image to start with. So you can see here, or you could pretty much guess, that these values are the pixels. We set this to 1920 by 1080. We basically crop to the original size of the image. Now, rather than manipulating these values at this point, what we can do is we can grab the corners and begin to crop our image using the corners themselves. I'm just going to manipulate our node tree so that it's out of the way. And then let's isolate the dodgeball. So we can position this, move down, and then allow that to composite, and there you go. So now we have a cropped image that only shows our main dodgeball. The one thing to note here is that the image size in the viewer node is still the same. It's just that the rest of our image has been replaced by a transparent background. If you want to crop the image size so that the transparency actually goes away, you can left click on crop image size here in the properties, or if you find the node itself, you have the same options here. So if we left click, now you can only see the part of the image that had been cropped. In fact, at this point, even the title image has disappeared because Blender considers the main image to be the main image of this setup. Now, if we were to reorder these two, so if we take the bottom input here and plug it into the top input, let that load up, you can now see that we can begin to see the title image above, but we can't actually see all of it. So what we're going to do here is we're simply going to revert this back to its original. And since I prefer to have the entire image anyway, we're just going to delete the crop. So just hit X to delete, and then plug in the lens distortion output to the alpha over input. Let that composite, and we're back to our original image. The next thing we're going to look at is how we can manipulate the color values of our title image, but using a new node known as a color ramp. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a color ramp node, Shift A, I'm going to add converter and select color ramp. And then we're going to position the color ramp. Let's position it here so we're changing the color before we manipulate the transform. As you can see here, when we change the values using the color ramp, you can see we've got a black and a white value. We're also changing the values of the transparency that surrounds our image. So now we're getting basically different shades of grey. To solve this, we're going to basically do two things. First of all, we're just going to move these nodes across, and then we're going to add an alpha convert node. So go to converter, alpha convert, and position it about here. I'm just going to turn off snapping to make things a bit easier. Now you can see that's a little bit better, but we still can't see the image underneath. What we can tell based on our color ramp is that the black values of the image represent basically this point here. So if we just zoom in on the color ramp, you see we have these different points here that we can left click to select. So this black value here, this basically represents everything that is behind the title. What we need to do is we need to make this into an alpha channel. We can do that very easily by left clicking on the color and setting the alpha value to 0. Once we do that and allow it to composite, then the black disappears and we can see our image. But while it is still just about there, the title is no longer what you would call visible. So what we're going to do is we're going to first of all add another one of these points or color stops as they are known as. And then I'm going to make sure that the alpha value of this color stop is set all the way up to 1. And then we're just going to drag it up to about here and change the color to green. So if I do that and allow it to composite, you can see that we're beginning to change the color of the title. The positioning of these color stops will influence what the color of the title actually is. And you can see that this specific image was created so that the two words here end up as different colors. If we position this color stop here and move it all the way up and release, then we end up actually with a pure white word here. So once you understand exactly what your color ramp is doing to your image, then you can begin to manipulate these values to get the effect that you want. So I know, for example, that these two color stops are in pretty much the right place. So now I can just manipulate what these colors actually are. I think I'm going to go with the green value. I'm going to set that to maybe a sort of purplish color. And then with the white value, let's set that to let's go with a bright yellow. So something like that. And so now using the color ramp node, we have been able to successfully alter the colors of our title image. And if we ever want to manipulate those colors, we can always come back to the color ramp node. So now we're coming towards the end of the tutorial here. And one thing that I want to do before we finish is I want to add what is known as an ellipse mask. Now an ellipse mask is going to allow us to basically brighten the center of our image. It's basically going to create a vignette that's going to brighten the center of the image but darken the outside. In order to bring in an ellipse mask, we're going to hit Shift and A. We're going to go down to where it says Matte and we're going to select Ellipse Mask. And let's position the mask. Let's actually position it after the alpha over node. Actually, no, let's do it before. Let's do it before alpha over, but after lens distortion. This is what we get right now. We basically get a grayscale image behind, and the ellipse mask itself is this very obvious white color that's just overlapping the image. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure it's the right size. Let's set the width to a very high value, 0.95, and then the height to a value of, let's go about 0.5 for the height. To solve the issue that we have here, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take my ellipse mask out of this setup, move it down here, just reorganize things a little bit, and I'm going to add a mix RGB node. I'm going to go Shift A, color, and then mix. We're going to pop the mix RGB node into here, and then we're going to plug the mask for the ellipse mask into here, and then we're going to change this from mix to multiply. Once we do that, you can see the image within the ellipse mask, but not around the outside. To fix that, what we're going to do is we're going to add a blur node. So go to filter and then blur. And then we're going to change this from Gaussian to fast Gaussian, and then select relative. So relative uses percentages along the X and Y axis. And if we increase this to say 33, and then increase this to something similar, so 28, then you begin to see the ellipse mask take effect on our image. So we've got these darker corners, but it maintains and even highlights the brightness in the center. And then we can manipulate the factor value to determine how strong we want our ellipse mask to be. So a factor of 1 looks just a bit too strong for my taste. So I might just go with a value of 0.8, because I only want it to be a relatively subtle effect. And then it begins to look a little bit more suitable around those edges. So we've done a lot of work at this point. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to take these guys here, 1, 2, 3, 4, and let's take number 5 as well. And what we'll do is we're just going to create a frame for these 5 to fit in. Let's go and hit Shift A, layout, frame. And we're just going to plug each of these into this frame. And then reposition. Once I've done that, I'm going to select the frame. We can name this as Distortion. And then let's give it a pinkish color. Zoom in a little bit, and then let's just make sure that these are snapped into place. We're going to once again enable snapping, and then we're just going to position these so that they pretty much line up with each other on either the X or Y axes. If we zoom out, this is what we have so far for our composite tree, and I think the main takeaway from this is, as long as you have a good idea of what each of these nodes are doing at this point, then you should be good to go. If anything confuses you, always make sure to just rewind and just have a look at a certain part. I do leave timestamps in the description because these are relatively long YouTube tutorials. So if you ever want a recap on, say, the lens distortion, for example, I will leave a timestamp to let you know where in the video we talk about lens distortion. But that's it from me for this video. Thanks guys, and I will see you in the next one. Thanks for watching guys. If you are interested in learning more about Blender, then feel free to subscribe to our bi-weekly newsletter, which gives you updates on all things Blender, including future releases of Blender, tips and tricks on how to use some of your favourite tools, recommendations for things like tutorials, courses, as well as things like add-ons or websites that can improve your Blender experience. So thanks guys, and I hope to see you in the next video.